Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Happy Friday guys, or happy Saturday, depending on when I decide to publish this video. I haven't decided yet. I'm delighted to see you guys, as usual, although today's topic is going to be somewhat of a deep, dark one, you could say in a certain sense. Before I move on to the topic of the video, I just want to say quickly that down below you'll have links to the ebook of my new book on the INFJ type, the Ecstatic Soul. Not very modestly, admittedly, I would like to insist that this is the deepest investigation, the deepest exploration of the INFJ type ever undertaken. So if you want to have the deepest possible understanding of the type, I recommend that you get the book. The paperback version, I think, is now available in the United States. I'm still working with my designer on trying to make the cover a little bit more clear, a little bit more stark, a little bit more crisp, as it is already for the ebook. So just to let you know about that. Now, the 16 personalities and mental illness. Now that's a deep topic. That's a very complex and also potentially thorny topic. So what I want to clarify from the beginning is that I'm not going to be talking necessarily about specific types of mental disorder or insist that there's a strict correlation between being of a certain type and having a certain kind of mental disorder. This is not where I'm going to be headed, not only because it's dubious but also because I think it's probably wrong. Nevertheless, I think it is useful to bring the discussion forward towards topics that are maybe not talked about enough, in our personality community. Partly because a lot of the personality conversations are about either, entertaining oneself or reassuring oneself about our identity. Now, these are good things to work on. I'm not saying they're bad things, they're good things, but I think that we can enlarge the field of discussion to also tackle serious issues such as how to transform your life, how to work on yourself so that you avoid falling into a pit of mental unhealth. And if you do fall into a pit of mental unhealth, because this can always happen, it's happened to me several times, so I don't want to single myself out as an exception here. I am not, certainly not. If you do, though, how can you get out of it? Now, presumably, a psychotherapist is the first thing to think about. Nevertheless, how can you understand yourself better so that you can have a better idea of how to move beyond your state of unhealth? And I think that the personality resources can actually help, notions of personality types, if we look closely at some of the things that were said, not by Myers-Briggs, not by later generations of modelers, but by Carl Jung himself. I've been engaging deeply and intensely with the works of Carl Jung for the last couple of months, and there is a treasure of insights about these topics in his work, about pathologies, about psychological pathologies, and their relationships with type, and that's kind of what I want to talk about here. So here is the crucial thing that you have to understand to link the concept of having a type and the concept of being mentally unhealthy. How to link the two is to consider that for Jung and for Jungians in general, there is a connection between the subject relationship with the object, so the subject being like the internal, the self-directed part of the psyche, relationship with the external world, the world of objects. So there's a relationship between the form that the interaction between subject and object takes, and the kind of mental illness, the kind of mental unhealth that you're likely to develop. And specifically, Jung says that here there's a crucial distinction to make between the introverted types and the extroverted types. He thinks that introverted types are going to experience certain types of mental unhealth that are different, broadly speaking, with exceptions, of course. The boundaries are somewhat fuzzy, but there's going to be similarities among states of unhealth in introverts and then in extroverts. And of course, within introverts, The unhealth will also be kind of colored by whether an introvert is dominated by thinking, by feeling, by intuition, or by sensation, and among the extroverts, same. So you have, in a way, you end up having 8 categories of a move into unhealth. And that brings with it also ideas about how to address the unhealth. So in this video, let's not think too much about how to address these issues. Also, I'm not a psychotherapist, so I don't want to provide advice that would go beyond the perimeter of my special area, my specialty. But we can try to analyze them a little better. So let's consider the case of the introvert, first of all. So typically, what do we understand by unhealth in the post-Myers-Briggsian kind of movement? Because most of our videos on YouTube, most of our conversations, they're really influenced by Myers and Briggs, whatever we might want to say. We don't often go back to Jung, at least not enough, especially because the insight into unhealth is so profound in Jung. What Myers and Briggs have sort of led us to believe is that unhealth seems to be manifested in introverts primarily through a phenomenon of looping. So looping the dominant function, which would be introverted, and the tertiary function, which would be extroverted. Now, the tertiary function would be also introverted, and you loop the NI and the TI in the case of an INFJ, NI and FI in the case of an INTJ, TI and SI in the case of an INTP, and so on and so forth. And you will easily find a lot of different descriptions of what looping looks like on the internet, in the literature, current dominating literature. So a lot of the unhealth that is dominant, unhealth explanation that is dominant in the personality community today is really, really concentrated around this idea of the looping. And actually it's applied to extroverts kind of in the same way, except that here it is the extrovert functions that are looping. You have some literature on the notion of being in the grip of the inferior function, but once you dig into the detail of what that looks like, it's kind of vague. It's like you are behaving as if you were on unstable SE dominance if you are an INFJ, or as if you're an unstable SI dominance if you're an ENFP, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't really go beyond that, and we don't really get to an understanding of what's specific to each type. Jung says something different. Jung doesn't focus on any notion of looping between the primary and tertiary function, partly because in his work he doesn't really talk about the tertiary function. This is kind of a novelty, an innovation of Myers and Briggs, and credit to them, because the tertiary function is something that seems to have a lot of explanatory reality and validity. But Jung considers the tertiary function to kind of point towards the domain of the inferior, undifferentiated functions. But he does believe that the inferior function of a type is going to be the asymmetrical equivalent of the dominant function. So NI would have inferior SE as an asymmetrical counterpart, and so on and so forth. But what he believes is that when mental unhealth sets in, what is happening is a lot more nuanced and complex than either looping or being in the grip. And this is where we can really get really interesting insights into personality through psychological types by Jung. Consider that an introvert's relationship to the object is dominated by introversion. Therefore, instead of being projected towards the object, the introvert tends to raise defenses against what the object might do to him. So he's defined by a relationship power over the object. The introvert can only be reassured when he feels like he is in control, that the object is not going to harm him. By contrast, the extrovert is projected toward the object and always is attracted to the idea of fusing with the object. So there's a very different inverse dynamic going on. And in the case of unhealth with an introvert, as with any type, what Jung believes is that there's an overdominance or an over-reliance on the dominant function. So it's true that even in Myers-Briggs, this is something that we tend to agree with. But he thinks that if the dominant function is relied upon too dominantly for too long a period of time, what happens is that the function that is repressed, the unconscious function, which would be the inferior function, is repressed to such an extent that because the unconscious always wants to express itself, the will of the individual will not allow the unconscious function to express itself because it's being repressed. So what happens over time is a growing autonomy of the unconscious function. And it becomes so autonomous that at some point it ends up as a mental complex developing a life of its own and erupting onto the surface of consciousness, not taking control of the individual and his personality. The individual will still be dominated by their dominant function. But what's going to happen is, what's going to happen is that the dominant function is going to have to constantly face and try to oppose this independent, autonomized agency, conscious agency of the inferior function, which is much more undifferentiated, much more archaic, much more infantile, much less developed, much more aggressive. And so what you get in Unhealth is a relationship, in the case of an introvert, a relationship to the object which is mediated through introversion. So there's this tendency to kind of try to get as much subjective power against the object as possible. If that dominant function is relied upon to such an extent that it ends up leading to the autonomy of the unconscious function, which then erupts as a counter system, almost as a counter personality, what ends up happening is that this relationship to the object is having to contend with its opposite. And that's what neurosis is. And as you know, neurosis is clearly an indication of mental unhealth. It can lead to worse forms of mental unhealth, potentially to disorders. But neurosis is really this. It's when the unconscious has become autonomous and it takes up a fight against the conscious personality both on the plane of consciousness, except that you have the highly differentiated conscious personality with your dominant and auxiliary functions, and then like a more influential than ever archaic personality that's trying to impose itself. And this leads to all sorts of neuroses, and Jung thinks that depending on what your dominant function is and what therefore your unconscious inferior function is, the neuroses are going to be of different kinds. So in the case of the extroverts, it's going to be an inverse relationship. So the conscious is among objects, fusing with objects. The unconscious is always going to be a counterpart that, you know, to use a typical term in psychoanalysis, compensates for the conscious behavior. So the unconscious functions are going to be much more subjective, but in an archaic sense, because they are undifferentiated. Which means that if those repressed functions become so repressed that they develop a life of their own and oppose themselves with their own will against the will of the conscious agent, the extrovert's relationship to objects is going to become tinged. Their extroversion is going to become tinged with this almost mystical, infantile, archaic introversion, which will be influenced by the particular kind of inferior introverted functions that they have. And so just to give you a few examples, and we can maybe discuss these examples a little in a bit more detail in a future video if you guys show an interest in this. Jung actually has some suggestions to make about what kinds of disorders, or at least what kinds of neuroses happen depending on what your dominant function is. So for example, in the case of an introverted thinker, Jung seems to think that the neuroses are often going to be in the form of self-directed delusions, the valuation of the objective world. If it gets to a more serious case of disorder, he thinks that the introverted thinker is the most correlated with schizophrenia. In the case of the FI user, neuroses and mental unhealth will be predominantly defined by depression, anxiety, and fatigue. For the SI user, you'd have a lot of compulsion neurosis, OCD, and somatic symptom disorders, which used to be called hysteria. Jung thinks that that's quite common with SI users. With NI, you have OCD as well. Sensation and intuition, because they're both receiving functions, tend to have somewhat similar neuroses according to Jung. So there's OCD and there's hypochondria as well. And hypochondria, you can really understand it because like your dominant intuition is going to become so tinged with inferior sensation that it's going to be taken away from its prime focus and start mixing up also perception of the body. And because it's archaic, you can easily see how this could lead to forms of hypochondria. And as well as a compulsive tie to particular persons and or objects. Introversion in general, when it comes to disorders, tends to be more correlated with schizophrenia because of the self-directed delusions. They're not delusions about the external world, they're delusions about mental images of the self, as well as paranoia. Jung thinks that paranoia is very clearly more of an introvert's disorder. And one way of explaining this is that Jung believes that there's a two-stage energetic process of investment and divestment when you're dealing with situations. Investment means that you invest yourself in a situation and its interpretation, which creates a mental complex, and that demands a certain level of energetic investment or libido investment. In order to move on and focus on something else, you need to divest this energy in order to focus it on the other mental complex that will be required for the next situations. He thinks that extroverts have a very quick process of investments and divestments and divestment, which is why they're able to jump from situation to situation. So they process, they act, they move on. With introverts, it takes longer. They process, it takes a while, but also to move on to another action, it actually takes a lot of energy. Takes them a lot of energy, and it's a slow process, which is why it's not as easy for them to move from situation to situation. If you force it, can generate stress. But what Jung thinks is also that in some cases among introverts, the divestment, like the process by which you move on from a mental complex to another one, is so long in the case of an introvert that the introvert can end up spending so much time with the same mental complex that they may not be able at all to divest themselves of it, and the mental complex remains in the psyche, develops a life of its own, and becomes a permanent fixation. And this is the beginning of the paradox relationship with certain really fixed ideas that they cannot get rid of, and they behave and organize their lives around it. It could be linked to a difficulty of divesting themselves of a particular situation and what the mental construct that it leads to, like reiterated over like months and months and months and years, can become this fixated idea that influences the ego massively. Now, in the case of the extroverts, we have fanaticism. For TE, we have fanaticism, delusions of grandeur, and the persecution complex. Partly because unhindered TE mixed with like archaic inferior FI correlates with these. FE has, again, somatic symptom disorder or hysteria. SE has compulsive neurosis with a moral or religious streak, which I like. This is in the work of Jung, which would be due to projections of NI inferior and also a kind of overwhelming superstition. And again, the influence of NI inferior over SE dominance could explain that. In the case of any delusions, hypochondria, phobias of all kinds, and compulsive disorders of all kinds. And extroversion in general would have a relationship with the disorder called histrionic personality, like this desire to please, and which would be related to a desire to fuse with the object, which is always the case with an extroverted dominant function, but mixed with the inferior, which would distort it and contribute to the solidification of a disorder whereby the attraction to fusing with the object becomes as it were, it becomes an addiction. It becomes something that the subject has become entirely dependent on. So you can see that there is a great wealth of different analyses of mental health and unhealth that is contained in the work of Jung. I just wanted to give you a quick peek at it in this video, but I'll no doubt be making more videos on the topic in the future, and particularly what I like to do is to look at the different suggestions Jung makes for each function and look at whether we agree with it, whether we think that it could be updated. And also, once we have agreed with it, or at least come to some sort of conclusion, what do we think that we could do to work on that in order to move to a state of health? So this is not to say that the concept of looping, the theory of looping or being the grip is invalid, but this is an alternative view. The compensation of the unconscious becoming autonomous fighting against the conscious, leading to neuroses and worse. See you soon, guys. It's been a while. Bye-bye.